Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey Adapters, welcome back to another exciting episode. Earlier this year, I attended the fantastic Waterfront Conference in New York City, hosted by the Waterfront Alliance. The conference took place at the Jewish Cultural Center in Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. It was the first time attending an adaptation event where the Statue of Liberty was in view through the window. In this episode, you'll hear from state and local government officials talking about how they do coastal climate adaptation. We also have insights from private sector companies who are leading the way in shovel-ready adaptation projects. This conference was truly remarkable with the most diverse group of attendees I've ever seen. People are not just talking about adaptation, they're creating templates and programs that will help us adapt effectively today. The Alliance's WEDG National Adaptation Program is another innovative initiative that we'll highlight, showing how it's paving the way for resilient communities. You'll also learn how 3D printing technology is used to create artificial reefs and seawalls. We'll also discuss private sector national funding efforts that are driving these shovel-ready adaptations and a new, massive New York State grant program for adaptation. The City of New York's climate justice efforts are also front and center, and we'll dive into the concept of a cloudburst and how cities can manage these intense rainfall events. Yes, we cover a lot of ground in this episode. The Waterfront Conference was community-led adaptation at its best, and now let's get this episode started so you can learn all about it. Hey Adapters, joining me is Courtney Koenig-Worrell. Courtney is the president and CEO of the Waterfront Alliance. Hi Courtney, welcome to the podcast.
Hey Doug, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic, and so I'm very excited to have you on because I am going to New York City and I'm going to this Waterfront Conference that you're bringing me into. So we're going to start there. Ground people in the Waterfront Alliance. Who are you guys?
So Waterfront Alliance was established as a New York, New Jersey nonprofit about 17 years ago. And it was at the time when there was a real estate boom in the 2000s and the idea that this waterfront land of New York and northern New Jersey, which is about over 1,000 linear miles, that this land could be converted into high-rise luxury condominiums or one type of use that was very of great interest to real estate and to real estate developers, and that without an independent look, an independent voice, an independent analysis of what was needed for the waterfronts and coastlines of New York and New Jersey, we would lose opportunities to preserve this wide set of heterogeneous uses on the waterfront, everything from ports and industry to wetlands preservation and parks and residential housing, and so many things that make up a waterfront and a harbor and a coastal region as complex and densely populated as the New York, New Jersey region. So we were started for that reason and to really move forward with solutions and ideas and advocacy that would steer development and change in the right direction. But then after Hurricane Sandy, our focus, it was on climate change, but I'd say it got very pinpointed towards dealing with climate resilience and adaptation after Hurricane Sandy. So since that time, we've been doing a lot more. Our programs have grown. I would say about 75% of what we do is singularly focused on climate change adaptation and resilience in one form or another. And one of those things that we do is we hold a conference every year. We've done it since the beginning of the Waterfront Alliance. And this year we were just really excited because we had a huge lineup of speakers, more panelists, and strong focus again on climate resilience and adaptation, plus many other things that we do. And then also we focus this conference on communities, and most of our work, and we believe a lot of the work that has to be done to prepare the United States for climate change involves working directly with communities at the neighborhood level, at the city level. And that specificity was really brought through in our conference.
We're going to talk a little bit more about the conference because I'm headed to New York City to cover this. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the conference has evolved? Because you said it was there from the very beginning, and now climate resilience and adaptation is a big part of it.
Yeah, originally we put it together in order to make sure that these different sectors and interests for waterfronts and coastlines in the region were speaking to each other. So we wanted to have the ferry operators, the marine terminal operators, the environmentalists, the volunteer organizations, the housing developers, the park advocates, the cities, the city agencies, government staff, the state agencies, all of them to come together and talk to each other about a common interest that they don't ever talk about, which was the waterfront, the coastlines of New York and New Jersey, and the harbor. And so what turned into what was originally a conference just turned into the premier networking event every year for people who would see each other one time a year at our conference and would talk about these issues that otherwise in their sectors or in their professions, they would have no need or no reason and would not accidentally run into each other. They do it at our conference. So this interdisciplinary, cross-sector, multi-sector gathering and set of solutions that would then come out of it has been part of our DNA and part of the Waterfront Alliance conference for since the very beginning.
So where is it going to be hosted at? How many people are you expecting? To give us that.
It's at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Lower Manhattan in Battery Park. This museum this is the third year that we're going to be there. It accommodates our gigantic gathering of we're anticipating more than 600 people. This location evolved from the conference that we used to hold, which was on a boat. We would do this conference on a boat that would stay dockside for the morning and then take off and do a tour of the harbor while the panels were taking place. That was wonderful. It was a highlight of the year, but we outgrew the boat. And now we're going to be for the third year at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Lower Manhattan in Battery Park City. And what we're really excited about this year is that there's a very important infrastructure project being built adjacent to the museum. And actually, one of the rooms at the museum will provide a view of the construction of this project and allow us to actually hold a couple of conversations about how the project was planned and designed and what the construction means. And there's so much to say about that. So we're really excited about this year's location.
I love that you had it on a boat. There's no leaving early, so that was smart. So, where are they going to go? That's fantastic. Before I let you go, and you're going to come back at the end of this episode, can you just give us an overview sampling of maybe some of the themes? And you can't identify all the speakers, but maybe give us a few just so we know who's going to be there.
Yeah, so we are anticipating leadership from the administration, so in particular from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Organization. Jessica Granis will be speaking, and we're really excited to hear about all of the funding that the Biden administration has been able to provide to states and cities and municipalities, as well as different agencies and nonprofits. So we're really excited to start with that. We are going to take a look at resilience projects, in particular infrastructure projects that are complex in urban areas. One of the things that's really key in that is the Waterfront Alliance's program called the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines Program, or WEDG program, which is unique. There's nothing else like it in the country. And it's a standard or verification standard for waterfront and coastal development for both freshwater and saltwater systems. So that will be, the WEDG program has been established for a long time, and it will be a focus of several of the panels and discussions. And as I mentioned, our DNA for the conference, but also for the organization, is about interdisciplinary, multi-sector, integrated solutions. And we'll have an entire panel on that as the opening plenary. And we'll be talking to chief resilience officers from Florida and from New York, as well as one of the major opportunities that there is in New York City, which is the climate exchange on Governor's Island. We'll have the CEO speak about that. So other things that really excite me is that we're going to talk about cloudbursts and green and gray infrastructure. We're going to talk about how to measure climate resilience. We're going to talk about wetlands mitigation and restoration and the role of historic contamination and muddying the processes that are in place and to move wetlands mitigation faster in urban areas. We often find that historic contamination slows things down. And in an era of climate change where we want to move projects as quickly as possible, this is a real challenge. And then we'll also be talking about stakeholder engagement and local knowledge, how important that is, and what we're going to do to ensure that resilience hubs and these locations in communities where we have to be providing people information over a long period of time about how to adapt to climate change, how those resilience hubs in communities can be used and be important for communities, and also be a part of the exchange that has to happen with communities as infrastructure moves forward.
I am very excited to get to New York City and to meet you in person, to meet your staff there. So I'm going to have you back at the end of the episode, and I will see you in New York.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Susanna Randall. Susanna is the Chief Resiliency Officer at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Hi, Susanna. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
It's a treat having you on. But first, let's ground my listeners. So what are the general responsibilities of the Department of Environmental Conservation?
Oh, wow. We have a lot. We're a really broad organization. We span everything from fishing licenses, hunting licenses, growing fish, growing trees, stocking rivers and lakes and streams, issuing speedies permits, regulating pollutants, regulating polluters, air quality monitoring. We have our own forest rangers who go and help folks out of the woods when they get lost or get in trouble. Really critical service there, especially in our great parks in the Adirondacks and the Catskills. We have environmental conservation officers who are out there helping the public, making sure that we are safeguarding our natural resources and safeguarding people across the state. In addition to that, we have air quality monitoring, we have air regulations, and we really run the gamut. We even run summer camps. But here at DEC, one of the things that we've shifted from, we're a regulatory agency, but we have so many other things. We're also a major grant funder for communities to help implement projects that really get at achieving environmental objectives. And one of the big funding sources that we have that's relatively new here in New York is this Clean Water, Clean Air, Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act, or Bond Act as we like to call it, of 2022. And that's $4.2 billion to implement projects.
And can you describe your role as Chief Resiliency Officer?
Sure. So as Chief Resiliency Officer, I wear a few hats. One of them is really acting as New York's Bond Act czar, so to speak. And that's for the Clean Water, Clean Air, Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act, where we're investing $4.2 billion in communities across the state to promote and really improve resilience, really, as we face climate change and adapt to the changes that we're seeing. It also involves mitigating climate change. There's a whole host of funding options that we have and opportunities to help communities. So really running that day to day and working with agencies to get those dollars out the door. That's through the context, really, or the lens of being the head of resilience for the organization, for DEC. That gives me a little bit of a unique spot in that I get to collaborate with state agencies and authorities with the power of the dollar to really help move projects and advance the objectives that our state has to really achieve a more resilient future.
I know the grant is a really big deal, but it must be a challenge too that this is a big chunk of money that the state is now providing. Do you have to work with people that actually want to apply? Because sometimes people don't even necessarily have that climate expertise that maybe the grant is trying to fund. How is that process working? Is there an education, or are the people that are applying pretty sophisticated in what they know how to use, I guess, it for climate adaptation funding?
Yeah, so there's a real broad range of things. One of the things that we really focused on doing is breaking it down to say, what's the kind of project you're looking to do in your community, and take the burden of trying to learn all the funding sources off of the grantee or the community's shoulders. So you might say, hey, I'm a community and I really want to plant trees. Great. We've got a tree program that we're going to fund through the Bond Act, for example. Or we really want to do green infrastructure. We're going to do some green stormwater infrastructure. We want to do green streets. Awesome. We're pushing Bond Act dollars into programs that are already out there for folks to tap into to implement those projects.
I know I'm getting in the weeds, but now I'm just fascinated with this grant program. And so do you guys have an equivalent? There's the National Climate Assessment that gives that sort of foundational information around climate change. Is there a New York State equivalent, or do you just tap into that information?
So there's a couple things happening. The governor this year announced funding for and direction to take what in New York, we've done a lot of sector specific analyses or vulnerability assessments or adaptation plans. And we're really pulling together to do a comprehensive adaptation and resilience plan. We're in the planning stages on that. And that would really be the equivalent in terms of kind of that plan or monitoring kind of action agenda. The flip side of that is in terms of finding funding or directing people to implement projects. We've got a great website up that really provides a roadmap of what kind of things you can do to make your community more resilient or adapt, or what kind of funding opportunities there are. It rolls off the tongue. It's environmentalbondact.ny.gov. And I'd say check it out. You can check out some of the projects that we funded to date, some of the programs that we've rolled out with those funds.
I'll have links in my show notes for this episode. And I'd love to talk more about this grant program, but I need to pivot here. You were a keynote speaker at the Waterfront Conference. Can you give me some highlights about some of the things that you said?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the key things that really frames really my approach and the approach that we're taking is that we're zooming out. We're taking a watershed-based, a systems-based approach to how we look at resilience. When we look at the waterfront, when we look at the coastline, we're all connected. We're all in a watershed. And so what happens upstream impacts those downstream. And so we're taking this philosophy with how we fund projects in many of the programs we're moving money out through, but we're taking that approach to take a real focus on, I should say, how we approach resilience. It's looking at those ecosystems, looking at these natural systems and how we restore them so that they can provide those environmental benefits that really are so critical, not just now, but in our future. If they're not intact, then I think we're really in trouble.
What were some of the takeaways you took from the conference, and do you feel like it can inform your current role? And obviously, the Waterfront Alliance is all about partnerships, and they had quite a diverse audience at this conference.
Yeah, I think the fact that they bring so many folks from so many different parts of the waterfront, whether they be students, whether they be industry, whether they be researchers, that convergence, because those folks don't usually meet up, is really valuable. Because what it does is it helps us really see things through other people's eyes, which is really about community and connectivity, which is an underpinning of how we move ahead and how we survive the changing weather that we already see.
So I actually have background in state government and federal government, and I was really impressed with the Alliance was able to attract a lot of private sector folks. And so is that an area that your agency, is there that interaction happening? Because it doesn't always happen easily. And so the Alliance really did a great job recruiting those folks.
Yeah, and I think that they're a critical piece of it because often we see communities work with the private sector to really push the envelope. And there's some really exciting work that is being done in the private sector in terms of taking lessons learned from all across, not just the country, but the world, and bringing them to bear, really bringing them to put in the ground, so to speak, or in the water to help us move forward.
Did you have a favorite moment at the conference?
One of my favorite things about conferences are often the spaces between sessions, because it gives an opportunity for those deep dives and those conversations and connections offline where you can then say, oh, wait, let's connect on this. And that's like the comment you had of, hey, wait, I'm a Florida guy. She's a Florida girl. Wait a minute, let's connect. Because I think that we start to see and really connect on that human level, which is so critical to really understand different ideas and different concepts.
Okay, Susanna, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was great talking to you, and look forward to hearing more from you online.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Joseph Setkawi. Joseph is the Chief Waterfront Design Officer at the Waterfront Alliance. Hi, Joseph. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Just want to acknowledge we actually did a variation of this interview at the actual Waterfront Conference on a stage, probably in front of 600 people, but we're going to do it again here just to make sure that we get it right. And I'm going to ask you a few more questions, but that was a really fun thing to do with you at the conference.
Oh, absolutely love that.
What do you do there as the Chief Waterfront Design Officer?
My role is to lead our WEDG program, the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, which is a rating system for waterfront development that looks at the resilience of the site, how ecological it is, and accessibility. The WEDG program is approaching 10 years old, but it's gone through a number of variations over time. And I actually became what's called a WEDG associate, or someone who's taken the training before coming to Waterfront Alliance. So I've been involved with the program for about 4 years, even before I was a staff member here.
I want to break down the WEDG program here. I want to give people a real sense of what it's about. And so there are 3 services that are offered as part of the WEDG program.
There are 3 different areas that we work in. The first is WEDG verification. This is really the bread and butter of what we do. So folks are going to be familiar with the LEED standards, maybe Envision or sites. These are rating systems that look at a particular property and essentially try to figure out, are we getting this right? In our case, it's for the waterfront. So are you getting a waterfront property? We're looking at resilience, ecology, and access across a ton of different metrics. So WEDG verification is the actual assessment that we do of the site. We support that through our 2 other program streams. So WEDG Professionals, the training program that we offer, really geared towards architects, engineers, landscape architects, regulators, real estate developers to help them through kind of what makes a great waterfront site. And then there's our WEDG policy and finance side, which is looking at what are the different carrots and sticks that are out there that can encourage more sites to build this way.
All right. So how many projects have actually been verified?
There are currently 14 projects that have completed verification, and those range from parks in Wilmington, North Carolina, and Miami, a breakwaters site in Illinois, and then a number of sites in New York City that range from affordable housing to luxury and mixed-use development to port facilities to some of the really large resilience projects like South Battery Park City.
How many more are you expecting to get verified? I'm just curious, this is an ongoing process, but let's say over the next 2 or 3 years, how many more do you expect?
There are currently 20 that we have some form of commitment from in the pipeline. There's another, we expect that number is going to keep growing. So we're expecting a lot of rapid growth of the standard, including we've got our first site in Denver lined up.
I think it's one of those services you talked about, this professional training and such. And I'm curious about that, though. You said architects and all these kind of different people. What really is your goal? So you're there. This is what you focus on, but you're training these people to do the WEDG program. Would they just have the skills to start the process, but would they still come back to you to do the verification? How is that all linked up?
There's a couple of goals with the professionals course. And one of those goals is that it gives us our roster of reviewers. There are about 50 people who have signed up to be a reviewer through the WEDG standards, and they're the ones who are actually going through and scoring projects for us. So we try to bring in lots of different technical expertise for each of the reviews that we do. The bigger piece for the course, though, is actually around creating kind of ambassadors for the WEDG program. So we look at the course as our way to get people into projects who are excited about WEDG, who know how it works, who see the value in resilient, ecological, and accessible design, and essentially make sure that Waterfront Alliance then, and specifically WEDG, is in project discussions across the country. So we see it both as a kind of business development strategy for us, that these are the decision makers on projects. These are the people actually designing projects. They have a say in whether a project goes through WEDG or not, in addition to just whether it's building in the kinds of features that would make it worthy of going through WEDG. And then we also see there's a number of folks who go through the WEDG course who are at nonprofits, who are working for municipalities, and we see them as being able to play like an advocacy role after they go through the course, and that they know how to advocate for different design features and different things that make a waterfront great in the communities that they're living and working in.
At the conference, someone from Miami, and you'd mentioned earlier that Miami is doing this WEDG program. I guess giving an example of someone out there that's using the WEDG program, that's much different. Can you give us a few details about that Miami program, about the person who spoke to it?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about our site in Miami, the city of Miami put Jose Marti Park through WEDG verification. It is about to start construction. They completed design last year and submitted for WEDG verification. This is a small park right on the Miami River between downtown Miami, Brickell District, and East Little Havana. And the park has been going through massive change. There's tons of flooding on a regular basis. There's a number of resilience concerns there and a number of ecological concerns as well. So this park was ripe for redevelopment. There was an issue, though, as the site was being designed, and that a city council member, or their city commission member, had proposed a bill saying that they wanted to ban mangrove trees in the city of Miami, which was mangrove trees have a really significant role to play in resilience against waves. They're fantastic environmental ecosystem features. And the city council member, the city commissioner, wanted to ban mangroves within city parks. They're also really central to the design of this WEDG facility. WEDG was written into the grant that they had submitted to the state, that the city had submitted to the state for funding for the park. And they were one of the many ways that folks pushed back on this city commission bill was to identify that, hey, without the mangrove trees, it's going to be really hard for this park to pass the WEDG standards. If it doesn't pass the WEDG standards, now we're putting the funding at risk because WEDG was written into the grant itself. So they used WEDG as a way to advocate against this really terrible policy idea in Miami to get rid of the mangrove trees. But they used WEDG as an important leverage point in getting that bill ultimately squashed.
You basically walked us through like some challenges that exist out there, but just more broadly, what are some additional challenges that communities face to implement WEDG?
The challenges that we see are around funding, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone working in the resilience and adaptation space, that building more resilient features can be more expensive. You need to bring in additional fill to elevate a site. That's expensive. Oftentimes, the more interesting approaches to shoreline, where you're not just putting in a bulkhead wall or something that the regulatory agencies have seen over and over again, that can slow down the permitting process. You're going through like extra review. All of these things are not necessarily tied to WEDG, but are things that we see come up for the sites that are using WEDG all the time. Because times, the sites going through WEDG in a community are among the first to try to go really above and beyond in resilience to really create some really cool ecosystem spaces, but they run into all these hurdles that are a result of being first and having to do things that are outside of normal funding streams and simply cost more. Those are issues that we see fairly frequently. WEDG gives you a toolkit that can help make some of that easier. We have design strategies that we've seen work in different places that are in the WEDG manual. Oftentimes we see within permitting agencies, WEDG is a useful signal to tell the agencies, hey, this project's taking the ecology of the site seriously. So that can help aid in the permitting process. But funding and permitting for waterfront sites are always issues.
What would you recommend if someone wanted to bring WEDG into their community? What should they do?
The first thing to do, take the WEDG Professionals course. It's available on demand at wedgeprofessionals.org. That's going to go through the standard. You're going to see case studies of how different projects have used WEDG, including that site in Miami. You're also going to see kind of how community advocates have used it and where there are leverage points and process to start to have conversations about how do we make this site better. Because ultimately, goal of WEDG is if you're going to be building on a waterfront site, whether that's a newer updated park, whether that's a residential development, whether that's a breakwater that's meant for beach nourishment, whatever the project site is, the waterfront is the flagship site in the community. WEDG is going to help you do it right. So taking the course is a great first step. If you've got a particular project in mind, reach out to Waterfront Alliance and find our contact information on wedge.waterfrontalliance.org. Talk to us and we can strategize with you. How do you convince the city to do this? How do you convince the design firms to do this? And we can take a tailored approach.
For my listeners out there, now WEDG is a key climate adaptation planning process or tool, right? I just want to connect those dots.
Yes, WEDG is a tool to help projects and communities design waterfront site that's going to focus on resilience, ecology, and access. On the resilience side, we're going to be looking at things like how do you protect the site from coastal storms? How do you protect the site from riverine flooding? How do you protect the site from really significant precipitation, urban heat, all these different climate hazards that are coming? We look at WEDG as a tool that's going to provide both performance metrics. These are the things that projects should be aiming for, but then is also going to have design strategies that say, here are just things that we've seen work on different types of projects that you should consider for yours. Here are what we would consider to be the best practices. All of those are captured in what we call the WEDG manual that oftentimes project teams and planning council members in small communities are looking at almost like a checklist waterfront projects. And then our scoring is also based on kind of a checklist of those. How many of these design features that are going to make the site more resilient or that contribute to access or ecology, how many are really showing up on the site?
What was your favorite moment at the Waterfront Conference?
I would say that my favorite moment, I was talking with somebody from DC, a person from New Jersey who works for an engineering firm, and then another member of the Waterfront Alliance staff at the reception at the end of the conference. And each one of those had multiple follow-up. Each one of those people had multiple follow-ups for WEDG. Hey, we want to talk about this and this. Or I talked to someone earlier who has this project and wants to talk about it. And then we were just talking about how WEDG was such a uniting force across the conference, that it touches so many people's work who were there, and gave us a really long to-do list afterward, which I think is a mark of success for the event.
Fantastic. Joseph, thanks for coming on the podcast.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Karen Apple. Karen is the Climate Adaptation Lead for the Water Business Line at AECOM Metro New York. Hi, Karen. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. We're here to talk about the Waterfront Conference, but we're going to learn a little bit about you specifically. And can you tell us briefly at that 30,000 foot level, what is AECOM?
AECOM is an architectural and engineering consulting firm. We're listed as number one in the ENR Engineering News record for, I believe, transportation, water, and there's another one, that business line that we were ranked at. But we're a large global consulting firm, and we work on all different kinds of projects. I'm in the water business line, but we do transportation work with bridges and tunnels and highways, and we do infrastructure, buildings, environmental work, energy work. We have a business line called Buildings and Places that does architecture, landscape architecture, building engineering. Pretty much if you name it, we do it. And I'm leaving things out for time.
I realize you are a huge company. And what I do like to do is, as I follow the adaptation sector and as it grows and emerges, I'm always interested in the titles of people as they get in the space. And I like your title, Climate Adaptation Lead. That tells you a lot. And there's a lot of emphasis on resilience, but I'm glad that you're using adaptation in your title because I have a bias toward that. So that's very encouraging. And maybe before we jump into the conference and your role there, so you guys are doing a lot of adaptation and resilience there at AECOM. Sometimes these organizations are so large, but is there just like one division that's doing it like where you're at, or is it threaded in elsewhere?
It's across all of our business lines, and various business lines and people at AECOM have been doing this kind of work for years and years. It's really, how I look at it is it's really developed and grown and changed. When I started my work, I started with what was called ecosystem restoration. And so it's wetland restoration, stream restoration, a little bit of sustainable stormwater, but it's really evolved. I've been working for just over 25 years now in the industry. And it used to be called eco-restoration or ecological systems or environmental or green. And then it progressed to different words like resiliency and sustainability, and we use climate adaptation or climate change to talk about the work that we're doing. But AECOM has a sustainable legacies program where it's a developing program. It's been around, but it's being revamped. And what we're trying to do is take all of our climate change, net zero, nature-based solutions experts and overlay them across all the different work that we do to integrate it and integrate sustainability and resiliency work across all of our different types of projects. Obviously, being part of the water business line, almost everything we do revolves around resilience, sustainability, climate change, net zero, all those different key climate related focus areas right now. But what we're really trying to do is make it a part of every project, integrated into every project, and then integrate it into our corporate environment with everything from recycling to smart travel, et cetera.
We're going to pivot to the conference here. And so you were involved with a panel, Cloudburst Solutions for Communities. First off, why were you on that panel in the first place? I'm assuming the cloudburst is an important issue in the stormwater for AECOM.
Yeah, so I've been working with the Waterfront Alliance for years now. They're one of my favorite organizational groups, NGOs, networking groups to work with. And I've been part of their work for a long time. I worked on the WEDG guidelines, their waterfront development guidelines, right back when they first started, and always try to be very involved in the conference. And AECOM has been a big supporter of the conference as well. So we're already working on our panel for next year, right, with ideas for that. But we usually try to pull together a technical panel. I've moderated a few. I've been just a panel member on others. But the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, as part of the Mayor's Office of Climate Resilience, they have been working on updates to Plan YC and stormwater reporting and a lot of different policies and predictions and research and data. And one of the things that they've focused on is stormwater flood mitigation. So cloudburst is a program that they have. They are a sister city with Copenhagen, where they are exchanging ideas back and forth on different stormwater mitigation projects. And some success that Copenhagen has had with, we call them pluvial storms, which is basically a rainstorm or water that comes from a rain event as opposed to a coastal storm surge event. They've had some success with mitigating those events. And the issue is that they're becoming more intense, shorter duration storms because of climate change, because of extreme weather issues in general. And so that's the definition of a cloudburst. It's an intense short duration storm and usually impacts localized areas. In a city like New York with the 5 boroughs, you may have a large storm that comes through, and Manhattan, it won't even rain, or it will rain sprinkle. And then in Queens, one neighborhood can be completely flooded. So the weather patterns are really changing. The coordination and the back and forth and the knowledge sharing that they did with Copenhagen on our coastal storm surge work in New York City, Copenhagen's taking some of that. They're doing some work with the success that New York City has had on that. The same kind of reverse is happening, where DEP is working on implementing cloudburst solutions in New York City for different boroughs. And they had a feasibility, for different project sites, project areas, neighborhoods. They had a feasibility study that was done over the past couple of years. And then a program that I'm currently working on as the project manager for AECOM is one of 4 cloudburst neighborhoods that were selected as the, initial 4 projects coming from the cloudburst feasibility study. And that cloudburst program is something that the Waterfront Alliance was very interested in talking about, discussing, bringing to the forefront as part of the conference. They had the idea for the panel, and that was something that AECOM was definitely interested in supporting. And the Waterfront Alliance was able to invite one of the acting assistant commissioner for the Bureau of Environmental Planning and Analysis, BEPA, from DEP, who is running the cloudburst program, as well as another consultant, Ramble, from Copenhagen, who has done cloudburst work in the Netherlands, and then asked me to be the moderator for the panel. And then we were also able to bring in one of the directors of resilience for New York City MTA to be on the panel to really get a difference of opinions on, or difference of points of view of how cloudburst type storms are being managed both in the city and then in Copenhagen. And we've all had experience outside of the city as well.
You covered a lot of the panel's discussion. And what I'm curious, though, is this Waterfront Conference has, and this is the conversations I had with the Alliance, it's evolved because it's been around for a while, but it really is, they're looking at themselves as doing climate adaptation work on these coastal areas. And so cloudburst, you could just say, all right, you're dealing with stormwater and you can really stay focused there. But did it come up in the panel? Did the issue of climate change really come up? Is it something that you guys are thinking about? Or is it when you're just talking about stormwater management, it's not something that's discussed as much?
No, so cloudbursts, by, I would say, most people in the industry, are believed to be extreme weather that is the result of climate change. So you're going to apply some traditional stormwater mitigation measures or flood control measures or flood reduction, because you never say flood control because it's never going to be controlled, but flood risk reduction measures. But this project and cloudburst in general usually has a specific design storm, a more intense rainfall event that it's being designed for. And the assumption is usually that while it can provide help with normal mitigation, with normal rainstorm events, it's intended to capture the differential between what the sewer systems can handle and these larger, more intense storms called cloudburst events. It is focused on the design storms themselves. The actual cloudburst event is related and can be attributed by some people completely to climate change because of the extreme, intense nature that has not been seen in the past except during a hurricane. But for example, Ida was a cloudburst event. It was a very intense cloudburst event. The design storm for the New York City DEP program is an average of 2.3 inches per hour. Ida was, I believe, 3.15. The answer to your question is yes, that we absolutely are considering climate change, and all New York City, Boston, other cities, Miami. I don't work as much out west, but AECOM does, are all considering climate change and how they have to adapt to mitigating for stormwater and coastal storm surge based upon these more increasing and intense events.
Did you have a favorite moment at the conference?
Obviously, I always love doing these panels. So that was definitely my favorite moment, was the actual panel. I always love Q&A because you prepare for these panels by discussing with the panelists. You have questions that you're going to ask, and so they can be prepared, and they do different levels of preparation. I always love engaging the audience in the beginning, asking who knows what cloudburst is or whatever the panel may be about. Always engaging the audience in the beginning and doing our presentation. But yeah, I love the Q&A at the end because you really get to see what people are thinking about.
Okay, Karen, that was fantastic. You covered a lot of ground. I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Doug. It was really fun being on the podcast with you. This is my first one, so it was really fun.
Hey, Adapter. Joining me is Tyler Taba. Tyler is the Director of Resilience with the Waterfront Alliance. Hi, Tyler. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Doug. How's it going?
What do you do as the Director of Resilience?
I've been the Director of Resilience at Waterfront Alliance for the last 2 years. And before that, I was a Senior Manager of Climate Policy. So really, my role is focused on helping set the direction of the organization's policy and advocacy work as it relates to climate resilience in New York, New Jersey, and federally.
Let's dig into that a little bit there before we talk about some of the programs and such. But you do some youth outreach. You have the Estuary Explorers. These are things that we talked about before, but expand on those. What are those things that you do?
Estuary Explorers is a program that's been around for a long time where we work with youth in New York City public schools and actually help get them out into the waterfront. We also work with teachers and educators to help build climate change into curriculums at schools. And so we have educators on staff. My colleague Jake helps run that program. As you've already heard, we have the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines program. We have a maritime and working waterfronts program. But really where I focus in on mostly is around what's going on in terms of planning and policy in the region as with respect to climate resilience and adaptation. What are the needs? What are the gaps? And where can we be pushing on the legislator and city and state agencies to really move some good plans forward to make our region more resilient to climate change?
I think you just gave some of the foundation for that. But in a previous conversation, you talked about how resilience is a through line through all the work you do there. What did you mean?
Yeah, exactly. And so I talked about some of the program areas like our waterfront access, working waterfronts, maritime, education work. And it can sometimes feel like all of that is disconnected, but climate resilience really is the through line between all of that work. We want young people to know about the climate crisis so they can help make decisions and help push for solutions and be a part of the solutions to the climate crisis, especially in a moment where I think a lot of young people are feeling anxious about what to do. And so helping them understand what it means to be resilient, what are solutions, what is climate adaptation, I think that's helping build that next generation of advocates and planners and engineers and politicians who are going to help us find the solutions. And then when it comes to our other program areas like public access and like maritime, we're trying to think about how resilience is really embedded in the core of all of that work. Anything that's really happening along the waterfront in New York City or in New Jersey, you can't think about it without resilience or adaptation in mind anymore. And so we really see resilience and adaptation as this through line through all of the program work of Waterfront Alliance, but I think just more broadly across the region.
We're going to get into some of the policy and advocacy work, but I think a key part of that is you have this Rise to Resilience Coalition. What is that?
So Rise to Resilience is a coalition that launched back in 2019. Waterfront Alliance led a task force of over 400 people across the private sector, public sector, nonprofits, and really got to the root of the issue in our region at the time, which was that resilience and adaptation was not getting enough attention in the climate space here. A lot of the climate conversations have always been focused on mitigation and decarbonization, energy efficiency, all really great and important things. But I think after Sandy and especially after Hurricane Ida, we've really woken up to the fact that we haven't thought about resilience and adaptation. It's a newer field. And so we launched this coalition called Rise to Resilience that brings together experts in housing, in environmental work, in design, and volunteering and emergency preparedness, and really making the case that resilience is not just an environmental thing. It really is affecting everybody in different ways. And so we've built this really strong coalition of more than 100 organizations now, and we collectively come together to make climate resilience a more urgent policy priority.
Let's talk about the Alliance's advocacy and policy work, and it's related to the coalition. And we can't go over all the victories and all the things you're working on, but tell us of a really big recent victory that you guys had.
Yeah, one of big note, I think that we'd worked on for a few years was around flood risk disclosure laws in New York and in New Jersey. And so for folks who may not be familiar, flood disclosure is a tool that really helps prospective home buyers and renters gain access to flood risk history and forward-looking information about flood risk on their properties. And so in New York, actually, there was a law that did include disclosure of your flood risk and your flood history, but there was a $500 credit that could be paid by the seller to the buyer at the time of closing, and you could actually opt out of disclosing whether the property has ever flooded before. And so for us, that was obviously really problematic, and we saw that as a big loophole. And so we worked really hard in the legislature to amend the law to remove that $500 credit. And I'm really proud that as of March of 2024, any prospective home buyer or renter is now going to be given information about whether a property has flooded, whether it's in a mapped floodplain, whether an insurance claim has ever been filed, and the same for New Jersey. And I think it's really important because some of that information is not readily available. It's not easily accessible. And so we're really trying to lay the foundation of how people understand how climate change is going to impact you directly.
Congratulations on that. I have been involved with policy development in previous careers, and it's not easy. Sometimes it takes forever to even get minor things done. So actually having legislation passed is a huge deal. And so I was actually part of a conversation there at your conference where I interviewed Camelia Fernandez, who's a student at New York University. And I'm not going to explain it. I'm going to let you. She was doing some research work that complemented what you were doing with that disclosure law. Can you quickly tell us what she was looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So we worked with a great group of graduate students at NYU in their School of Public Policy, and we wanted to get a better sense of what the economic impacts of strong flood disclosure legislation could yield. And so not just passing the legislation and saying, okay, that's it, we passed a good law, but now what are the implications of it moving forward, and how can we start to build on top of that? So thinking about now that we have passed this law, and what does this access to information give to prospective homeowners and renters, and what can they do with that information? So if you're more aware of your flood risk, would you be more likely to take efforts to mitigate that flood risk? Because in some cases, people are still going to choose to move into those homes that maybe have moderate or even high flood risk. And it's not an end all be all. There's solutions and there's things that you can do to retrofit your home or take measures to reduce that risk. And so what can that access to information actually result? And so we worked with the NYU students to really try to get to a better understanding of the economic implications of flood disclosure in New York and in New Jersey.
Fantastic. We're going to pivot a bit here. We're going to talk about the conference. And so you were a part of the panel. Can you tell us what the panel was about and just some of the highlights from that?
I was on a panel called Stormwater Utilities as a Key Solution to Resilience Funding, which is a wonky title for a panel that's about looking at the role that stormwater utilities, local water and sewer authorities across states have in providing green infrastructure or doing storm sewer design, redesign in some cases, and then, of course, maintenance and operation, which is so important. And this is an issue that's come up and been really important to us at Waterfront Alliance and in the Rise to Resilience Coalition because we're working on a legislative effort to clarify some legal authority in New York around the role that local water and sewer authorities like New York City's Department of Environmental Protection or the Buffalo Niagara Sewer and Water District, what kind of authority they have to actually manage and create projects for stormwater. There's been some legal ambiguity around the role that they have in stormwater management. And so it's very clear to them that they can do projects that are related to sewer upgrades, but stormwater is not clearly written in the law. And so we wanted to look at some best practices from around the country. So we had some folks from New Jersey come on, and we had some folks from Washington, D.C.'s Water Authority come on and talk about some of the efforts that they've taken. And in some cases, I'm sure people have heard about stormwater fees and rate structures being created, as well as discounts and incentive programs that come along with that. And so this panel was looking at what those kind of solutions could bring or look like in New York.
Did you have a favorite moment at the conference?
As a staff member who's running around and trying to make sure that the conference is really going well, I was assigned to a few panels. And so there's a few that I didn't get to go to and some that I had to watch recordings of. But my favorite moment from the conference, I think if you had a chance to interview Lorian Farrell, she did the Morgan lecture. Her speech was definitely, I think, the highlight of the conference. I think she really did a good job of tying in. So for people who may not know, Lorian Farrell is the new deputy commissioner of the Bureau of Coastal Resilience in New York City. This is a new initiative that we launched to try to get to having somebody in charge of coastal resilience in New York City, which is a very difficult task. And she stepped up to it. And so she was one of our main speakers at the conference. And I think the way that she made her story really personal, the work really personal, that was definitely, I think, the highlight of the conference for me. So I'd encourage everybody to check that out if you haven't.
All right, Tyler, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Doug.
Hey, Adapters, joining me is Elijah Hutchinson. Elijah is the Executive Director of the New York Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Hi, Elijah. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, how are you doing?
Great. Thanks for being on the show. But let's ground my listeners first. You're actually relatively new to this position. Can you tell us what that office does?
Sure. The Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice is charged with New York City's climate policies and programs. And we have a lot of ambitious targets that we got to meet, including getting to net zero by 2050 and running on 100% renewable energy by 2040. On top of that, we're also charged with resilience and adaptation. So not only are we trying to combat climate change and the root causes like greenhouse gas emissions, but we're also trying to adapt the waterfront and communities and neighborhoods across New York City to be prepared for what we know is coming, which is hotter days, wetter summers, different temperatures, more variations in weather patterns, and more intense storms and more frequent storms.
That's great. And so I'm just curious, I guess, even about what you do on a day-to-day basis, because there's a lot of efforts out there, especially in the bigger cities, when you talk about climate justice, environmental justice, how you really incorporate that. So like what's a typical day? Because it's not necessarily even easy. Like a city like New York wants to do the right thing on these issues, but there's such momentum to funding and projects and such that it's not even necessarily easy to get those things in. How do you do it?
We ground a lot of what we're trying to do in metrics and data. One thing our office does is manages the greenhouse gas inventory for New York City. And we actually produce 4 different inventories, some of which are required by laws that we have from the city council and others that we know just make sense to do, tracking emissions from out of state or food or different sectors. But we also look at what are the problems and what are the solutions that we're trying to dream up. One of the things our office just did was release the Environmental Justice Report for New York City, which is a landmark analysis of all of the environmental risks and hazards and benefits that communities experience in New York City due to climate change, but also accounting for a long legacy of government actions, disinvestment, and decisions that have caused environmental justice issues across several communities that are usually underserved in New York City. And so we look at that information and data and we talk with our partner agencies. We try to find funding sources to launch new programs, and we develop partnerships with people on the ground and in the community so that we can make sure we're advocating for the things they would like to see happen in New York City.
This conference, Waterfront Conference, obviously about coastal adaptation. And it's my understanding in a previous position, you were with the Economic Development Corporation. And so how has that experience really informed the work that you do around coastal adaptation and thinking about environmental justice?
When I started 10 years ago at the Economic Development Corporation, and we were just doing the first studies of coastal resilience and adaptation, it was just in the context of a post-Sandy world where we were getting ready for how to address one kind of storm event that we experienced as a city. And it was limited in the number of hazards we were looking at. It was limited in the neighborhoods that we planned for because we were only really looking at areas that were impacted by the storm. And now there's a huge difference where we understand that every neighborhood, whether you're on the coastline or not, needs an adaptation strategy. And we also know that there's multiple hazards that we need to take into account for. It's not just hurricanes or storms. It's sea level rise. It's more frequent rain events. And then we have to be more sophisticated about the solutions when we're thinking about what is going to help. Is it flood walls or barriers? Or how can we think about integrating green and gray infrastructure and think about interior drainage and other more creative solutions that'll help us meet our objectives.
Let's talk about the Waterfront Conference. And so you attended this conference. What did you take away from that? How is that going to inform some of the work that you're doing?
I took away from it two things. One was that environmental justice is critical for being successful in us being able to tackle climate change. And I really appreciated hearing from people highlighting the importance of centering equity within the climate work and the climate space, because our office is one of the few climate offices in the country that has changed its title to be environmental justice and climate justice together. And that's a new approach where we're not just focused on the targets of getting to the goals, but we're focused on how we do the work and implementation and making sure that we can bring everybody along, because it's technically impossible to meet these goals if we can't bring along our environmental justice communities with us.
Did you have a favorite moment at the conference?
I did have a favorite moment at the conference, the end when you were doing the podcast with the executive director of, I believe it was called the Women in Sustainability. She's a national environmental justice leader. And she was reflecting on the day and noted that what gives her hope was really the youth and young people and the energy that she sees in the room. And I really relate to that. There's a groundswell of activism and intersectionality that is really highlighting and making people understand that we all really do care about environmental justice, even if we don't necessarily see ourselves as environmental justice advocates. But because we care about clean air and water, and in New York City, our commute, our food, our safety, those are all environmental justice issues. And so it was nice to see recognition at a waterfront conference about all of the intersectionality of these issues in the movement itself to really see meaningful change. And to help with that, she mentioned the EJ NYC, which is something that our office released with WEACT, which is one of New York City's oldest environmental justice organizations that co-chairs with us our Environmental Justice Advisory Board. And so it was really great to see on stage recognition of the work of those communities in advancing these projects and these policies forward.
All right. Yeah, that was fun for me too. That was Diane Dillon Ridgely, and she was quite a character, and she was quite a storyteller, right? Which is really important. I think so often we miss the side of the storytelling and narratives and the people in the work that we do. Too often it's focused on the physical without really understanding why we're doing this work and who it really serves. Elijah, this has been great. I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Great. Thanks so much.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Carly Foster. Carly is a vice president and the water management practice director at Arcadis. Hi, Carly. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Let's ground people first. What is Arcadis?
Arcadis is an international design and consulting firm. We are headquartered in the Netherlands. We have quite a few offices in the United States. There are 36,000 of us. We do work in the mobility sector, places, communities, buildings, resilience, and intelligence, so also technology.
Let's hear about your role. What are some of the bigger things that you do there?
I am the new water management practice director. Prior, I was the principal resilience lead for our group in North America. And water management is a group of scientists, planners, engineers, consultants, modelers, and we do climate adaptation all the time, planning, detailed risk assessment, quantitative analyses, design and engineering of climate adaptation infrastructure, coastal infrastructure, things like that. Funding. So we have a national funding team that I help operate, and also things like asset and enterprise risk and resilience. We also do quite a lot of risk modeling.
I know how these larger corporations might work, and there's different teams that might cooperate doing the overlap in these things, but I'm just trying to get a sense of how big is this adaptation team there?
My team is about 160 professionals.
Okay.
And we work with professionals in other teams and in other disciplines as well, as climate adaptation is extremely interdisciplinary.
But you just mentioned, and we said you do all climate adaptation all the time. Can you elaborate on that? What does that really mean?
Me personally and my group, historically, I've worked with communities, states, critical infrastructure, and private sector entities at all scales, whether a single building or structure or utility or hospital, to a neighborhood, a municipality, a region, the state, supporting federal agencies, supporting international companies and their portfolios. We help them understand and address risk to their mission, to the people that they serve, to them at a physical level, as well as a company and revenue level as well. So understand that risk, quantify that risk, address that risk in ways that might include policy development, program development, but also physical projects and improvements, new governance structures, ways of working, strategy, and also supporting the detailed design and engineering, the implementation planning, the implementation itself, funding, benefit cost analyses. So the entire decision arc and entire implementation arc associated with climate-related risk.
So that's pretty comprehensive. So I've had this conversation with other groups, and especially like conservation groups. And so they'll have an adaptation section and they're doing adaptation. And what they struggle with is that everyone else there is doing conservation and they don't necessarily think they're doing adaptation. But the adaptation people are like, we're all doing adaptation now. And so with such a large corporation that you're at, do you feel like the broader group there that you're with kind of understands that it's probably just lots of overlap with all sorts of other teams that aren't necessarily saying that they're doing adaptation?
Yeah, actually, that's one of the things that I enjoy most about working at Arcadis. There are so many Venn diagrams of activities taking place, and we are also very much sort of a matrixed organization and are always working to break down silos and collaborate across disciplines. We have things called communities of practice where people from any part of the company can participate in those communities of practice to learn more, to share knowledge, to engage in solving the wicked problems that we find ourselves and our clients facing. And on any given project, I might be working with people from our mobility sector, from our energy sector, from our urban forestry group. And I think that part of the reason that it's so easy for us to collaborate is that the very mission of the company is about this kind of work. So we're all in on it in a way, and we call it accelerating the planet positive future.
One other thing about Arcadis that I want to talk about is that these national funding teams, and I find this very fascinating. And what is that? It sounds very useful because everyone's looking for funding, and it wasn't until recently the federal government has gotten into it a big way, and it's opened up a lot of possibilities. But you have a team there where you're working with that's dedicated to finding funding, right?
Yes. So I helped found the national funding team back in 2014, and we've been doing funding related work long before that, but we started creating this national network. And it came out of our resilience planning practice because there are no dedicated revenue streams for this kind of transformative work. And so we have to be pretty scrappy about how we make sure that the plans that we develop are implemented. We don't want to be doing things that are just going to sit on a shelf. So it became a natural evolution of our work. And we connect across all of our divisions, and we are constantly building capacity and sharing knowledge so that we can really help drive these projects forward.
We're going to talk about the Waterfront Conference. Can you tell me a little bit about your involvement with that? And you were actually on a panel or leading a panel there?
I was. So I moderated the panel Smarter, Better, Faster. It was really focused on how to move transformative critical projects forward more expeditiously and not cutting corners in terms of the decision-making processes or the environmental due diligence that is needed or stakeholder engagement. But once the project is really in a space where we're ready to go, how do we stop getting bogged down? What are the clogs in the pipes and how do we move through them? And so I was joined by an extraordinary panel of professionals, and we spoke about alternative project delivery and also the different levers and places of project implementation that we could move things.
Could you give us a few more highlights from the actual, whether it's good questions? What did you feel like people got out of it?
Allison Landry and the team that sat on the panel with me spoke a lot about how complex it is to implement climate adaptation infrastructure in an existing urban environment. And the New York City metro area has some of the oldest infrastructure in the country. And that means that the below grade environment is complex. It's sometimes really unknown. And that means that there may be, regardless of how much work we do on the front end during the design process, we're still going to be moving into construction with unknown unknowns. And this is where different types of project delivery might be more effective. For example, progressive design build, where you are designing and building in stages and really adapting as you go.
Was there any other sessions or panels that stood out for you where you learned something new?
I really enjoyed the session on green infrastructure and maintenance, because when we spoke earlier about the full arc of the decision-making process and implementation, we also get into sticky wickets when it comes to the actual enjoyment, maintenance, and then future adaptability of these climate adaptation solutions. And so it was a really fascinating panel about the ways in which we can bring in additional resources to help with the management of high maintenance green infrastructure, that community members can get involved, and just some of the types of creativity and balls of yarn that we need to unravel in order to make this all more effective.
And can you tell me just a little bit about, you have a partnership with Waterfront Alliance? Is it a group you work with regularly?
The Waterfront Alliance is a really excellent partner to those of us working in this space. They invest in solving problems like the ones that we've been talking about, hosting and convening subject matter experts to address those problems. The Waterfront Conference itself is just a very value add for any of us that are working in this space in the region.
Did you have a favorite moment from the conference?
My favorite moment from the conference was walking up to the building and seeing how much construction was happening around the building. And we were still able to hold the conference within. But it was a good reminder for me of how disruptive some of the things that we need to do for climate adaptation are and the impacts that can have on the communities around us, but also that we can work around it and we can find ways around it. And I thought it was really cool that we still had the conference in that building in an area that was being heavily affected.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. I think that was actually a WEDG project, and then you have the Statue of Liberty in the background, and the facility itself was really good. So yeah, it all delivered too. If people want to learn more about the work that you're doing and what Arcadis is doing in this space, what should they do?
They can find me on LinkedIn, and they can also go to our website or our social media. I think the Arcadis social media is a great place to go because you can see what's happening on any given day, whereas the website is a little bit more static. But we have blog postings there, a lot of thought leadership, and please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you're interested in learning more about the firm or what we do, or we're also hiring.
Fantastic. Carly, I'll have your LinkedIn profile as a link in my show notes for this episode. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all you do.
Hey Adapters, joining me is Maor Besner. Maor is the Chief Technical Officer with eConcrete. Hi, Maor. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming on. And first off, let's just get my listeners grounded. What is eConcrete? What do you guys do there?
eConcrete is a technology company that transforms any kind of marine concrete infrastructure into a living, thriving ecosystem. So if I break that down, basically 7 times out of 10, the material of choice while developing marine infrastructure, concrete is the material of choice. The reason for that is it's cheap, it's durable, it's easy to shape. A bad byproduct of that is it's not so good for the environment it's placed in. The reason it's not so good for the environment it's placed in is because of its adverse chemical composition and also the flat surface plane of traditional concrete manufacturing. At eConcrete, what we do is we treat the material, making it neutral to the marine environment and a little bit stronger, thus longer lasting. And then it's just a matter of recreating habitat upon the infrastructure that needs to be built.
You attended the Waterfront Conference hosted by the Waterfront Alliance. So why did you attend the event? As a private company, you have to justify those things. Why was it important to you to attend the event?
It's a 2-part answer. First and foremost, the Waterfront Alliance are the leading forefront of responsible construction in the marine environment. And in our day and age, it's very easy to get away with just developing infrastructure. But when you do that in the marine environment, it tends to have a lot of byproducts. Some of them are negative. And the Waterfront Alliance does not allow that to happen or is trying to minimize the negative effect as much as possible. And that is at the utmost important to our company as well. So apart from the fact that I couldn't agree more with their cause and want to, I don't know what the word is, but I want to stand in their side, I think it's also a very relevant place to hear what's going on, hear what are the real challenges of responsible development in the marine environment. Meet the designers, meet the developers, meet the people that are considering using the WEDG guidelines, for instance, and being a part of this alliance and keeping a finger on the pulse on what's happening. And at the same time, provide solutions that may come in handy for the people who are seeking for them.
Let's go back a little bit more specifically in what you do there at eConcrete. And you said in a previous conversation that you guys like to transform regular concrete into a living ecosystem. That sounded very interesting. What did you mean by that?
I think it all comes back to design. And obviously, when you develop something, you want it to be A, functional, and B, if possible, not too expensive. And a lot of times when developers need to do this trade-over between develop quickly and will it be okay for the environment I'm developing in, they tend to take the first and not the second option. We've worked very hard on streaming a solution that goes hand in hand with both objectives. Can develop the same kind of infrastructure you would like to, for instance, a quay wall, a breakwater, a scour protection for a wind turbine. You'd have functioning infrastructure, but because you focus a little bit more on the material of choice and the way you design it, it doesn't have to have a negative effect on the marine environment. Vice versa, our multidisciplinary team of marine biologists, civil engineers, and installation professionals streamline a solution that is cost-effective for the developer, functional for the need of the infrastructure, and not too bad for the environment it's placed in. And in some cases, even pretty good.
Can you tell me some of your highlights from the sessions? What sessions did you attend?
I really enjoyed the keynote speakers, not only because of the influential things they had to say that were very inspiring, the engagement of the crowd. And I think the thing that inspired me most about the Waterfront Alliance conference this year is seeing how many partners there are that are responsible construction. And when I say partners, it's not necessarily people I work with directly. It's decision makers in all different levels of all different companies and organizations, whether it's government organization, private engineering firm, or city, municipality decision makers. The fact that so many people showed up and are willing to discuss content like what is the right way to develop a waterway, what size of containers need to be there, how do we tackle tomorrow's problem today, shows that there is a big shift in this paradigm that's called development. And it gives me a lot of hope to see that a generation has changed, not because it's different age of people, but it's a different way of thinking that has entered all level of multiple kind of organization. And I think that's the sweet spot where the Waterfront Alliance is so relevant to this region.
Do you have a favorite moment from the conference?
There was a breakfast reception overlooking the South Battery project. I liked it because not only did a lot of people showed up, and I have to admit, eConcrete is a part of this project, but the way that the Battery Park Authority developer was showcasing how much effort and time they put into a project that was WEDG certified, and to see the amount of people showing up at 8:30 in the morning to hear about it was beautiful. And I think when you develop these kinds of projects, a lot of times things get messy. There's a tight deadline. Contractor wants to finish. The client wants what he wants. The design firm may have seen some things in a different way than the client. But at the end of the day, all of these people want this development to happen in the best way possible. And for me, it was a great opportunity to sit in a room with all of the stakeholders I just mentioned and more, and to see Joseph calling out how the WEDG guidelines help transform these projects and these cities' waterfronts into something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And that was the favorite moment for me.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks, Mayo, for coming on the podcast, and thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you very much for having me, Doug. And thank you for the Waterfront Alliance for doing a great job. Keep at it.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Mason Sears. Mason is the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at SF Marina Systems. Hi, Mason. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on, Doug.
Can you briefly tell us about SF Marina Systems? What do you guys do there?
Sure. SF Marina Systems is a designer and manufacturer of concrete floating structures. History over 100 years, and started out building marina docks, fishing piers, moving on to floating breakwaters, floating foundations for homes or hotels or event piers, and then floating breakwaters to protect harbors from waves and the elements of the ocean. We also do floating piers for larger fishing vessels, ferries, ships, Navy, Coast Guard, and looking to the future of our systems being used possibly in power generation and whatever else may come on the coastal area.
And I was poking around your website, and you have a lot of imagery there, and I'll have links in my show notes, but it's just really complex. You think all these docks, and you guys can really make these complex systems, but I guess you have to do them in coastal areas. Why did you attend the Waterfront Conference?
I used to attend the conference when it first started about a little over 10 years ago, and was excited to come back, fit my schedule, and reintroduce myself to the group of people that I met. I found it to be a really nice one-day, smooth and quick event with good networking. I really enjoyed the breakout sessions, the different learning opportunities that were presented. I attended one on resilience and one on the Waterfront Alliance's WEDG program. Plus, going to New York is always fun, and being a construction person myself, getting to see the Battery Park Resiliency Project under construction was a really nice feature.
Yeah, there was a lot of activity going on there right outside the Jewish Cultural Center. Yeah, it was really interesting to watch, and everyone was fascinated because I think it was a WEDG project. And so here we are right next to it. So that was exciting. So you explained why you went to the conference, but maybe you could give a little bit more detail. For being in a private company, you have to justify why you're going to these things. So why is it really relevant to your company?
We don't sell lots of units. Like, we're not selling Frisbees. We're selling very specifically highly designed concrete floating structures. The conference had opportunities to network with engineers, user groups, and end users, which obviously influences our designs and helps us get into their markets and educate them about us and learn about all the groups as well at the same time.
Folks like you there, we had concrete people, we had all a mix of private industry, but we had nonprofits there. But this Waterfront Conference, and the Alliance says as much, it's really turning into a climate resilience, climate adaptation conference, because that's what's happening on the coastal areas. Is that coming up in your industry, though? Is the language of climate change coming up in what you're doing? Or are you just adjusting and, all right, we have to factor in sea level rise? How does it all work?
I think our group is ahead of the curve. I think we are having lots of conversations with user groups, engineers throughout about resiliency and how our structures, specifically our floating wave attenuators, can reduce the wave energy that comes to the shore. If you reduce the wave energy, that may be able to influence the storm surge for certain waterfront areas that might be, let's say, an urban area, or others that need vegetation protection. So we see our systems as being a tool in the resiliency and adaptation space. See hubs, creating locations where people come together and they have resources and safety. A large floating structure can be a resiliency hub depending on what the climate or adaptation feature you're trying to adjust to. We hope to be in the conversation and part of it in the future.
I just want to follow up on that just a little bit there. So you're there designing and I think even constructing these docks and such. Do you guys even get to the level of we're using climate change models? Okay, there's a 5-foot sea level rise projection, or is there some other group that's doing that for you? Is that something you're talking about as you're designing these things?
Yeah, 100%. We typically work with other engineering groups that may be working directly with our clients. We have folks on staff that are looking at those items and how it relates, but many times, most of our customers have a private engineering group, construction management team, and all of those factors are being introduced to the design. When you come down to the details of each site, and each site is specific, the climate change and sea level rise and increased wave energy, different directions. Storms typically come from one direction historically, and now all of a sudden you may find that storm waves are coming from another direction, and that can really change a project's design.
Did you have a favorite moment at the conference?
The one that keeps coming back to me is that they sponsored a group of younger individuals to come to the conference and expose themselves to this group as well and learn. And there was a specific person, this guy, Justin, who was called out actually in the closing remarks, I believe, and lots of enthusiasm. And it was put a smile to my face to have somebody come up to an industry professional like myself and just keep asking great questions. And so that was a highlight, but it shows that there is a future of people striving to work on these adaptation issues when they're along the waterfront and obviously in all walks of life with that adaptation issues. And I know we had mentioned it before, but that's the one that kind of keeps popping up. And I think I mentioned some of the others, like getting to see the Battery Park Resiliency Project. That also was a nice moment of me geeking out on construction stuff.
If people want to learn more about what you're doing there, what should they do?
You can go to our website, sfmarinasystemsusa.com, and we do have a LinkedIn and Facebook and some other things that you can find off the website, including a contact page that leads you to me.
All right. Fantastic, Mason. I think you're the first person I have had on the podcast representing marinas, and so this is a first, so I appreciate it. So thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Aaron Morey. Aaron is the Director of Climate Resilience Planning at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, Construction and Development. Hi, Aaron. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Great to be here.
First off, let's ground my listeners. Can you briefly tell us what the construction and development part of MTA is?
Sure. So Construction and Development is an agency at the MTA, and we're really in charge of developing and building the capital infrastructure projects that keep our system going. We have extensive assets across the subways, buses, our regional railroads, bridges, and tunnels. So we work to keep everything in state of good repair and then also enhance our assets with new projects.
That's great. So can you tell me what you do there as the Director of Climate Resilience Planning?
Sure. So we're a relatively new team, climate resilience planning within C&D. And what our team does is we evaluate climate risks throughout the region. So not just in New York City, but obviously we have regional assets as well. And we use that information to guide capital planning and investments. Our goal is really to ensure that what we're building today and in the near future is prepared for the climate of tomorrow. We use readily available and publicly available climate projections to really guide what we're building.
And put you a little bit on the spot. Do you know, do a lot of transportation authorities like yours have resilience planning positions like yours? Have you heard about that, I guess, in the U.S. or maybe in Europe?
They do, actually. Yeah, and we meet regularly and informally with other similar groups. New Jersey Transit has a great team. Amtrak. Yes, I'm happy to say that it does exist.
All right, that's great. This is at 30,000 foot level, and one of the materials that you sent me was MTA's Climate Resilience Roadmap. And I know we can't go into much detail here, but again, at the 30,000 foot level, what's the purpose there? What are you trying to do with that roadmap?
Sure. So it's really a comprehensive framework to fortify our system against climate change. That's our 15 or 20-second answer. There is a lot of substance in the roadmap. I just want to highlight a few things. So first, we conducted a system-wide multi-hazard climate vulnerability assessment, we wanted to understand the magnitude and timing of climate change impacts on our infrastructure. And then we have 10 actionable goals within that roadmap. And these span actions for mitigating sea level rise, coastal storm surge, torrential rainfall, and extreme heat. And then we have a really robust implementation framework. So this is about capital projects. It's about working with our partners, working on design practices, and then making sure that our operating actions, like things like cleaning drains ahead of storms, that everything is optimized.
Again, maybe putting you on the spot, the coastal adaptation, but you guys deal with extreme heat in the roadmap, right?
We do, yes.
And can you just maybe talk a little bit about how is that even an issue for a transportation authority like yours?
Sure. So it's an issue because we have a lot of sensitive equipment and a lot of sensitive infrastructure that can be impacted by extreme heat. So for example, we have a lot of outdoor rail, particularly on our regional railroads. And when exposed to extreme heat, those rails can buckle, leading to service impact. We also have a lot of sensitive electronic equipment. For example, in our underground subway stations, we have communications rooms and other similar equipment where that equipment is sensitive to heat and can just stop working. Obviously, we have a lot of assets that are sensitive to extreme heat, but we're also concerned too about employee safety. So we have a lot of great heat emergency plans in action that we implement when temperatures are 90 degrees and above for one or more days. So we're covered. We're very proactive about ensuring the safety of our assets and our employees.
And just in a final note on that roadmap, I obviously didn't get to read the whole thing, but I was really impressed that you guys get down to the specific rail stations and what you're planning to do there. So I recommend, I'll have links in my show notes. If people want to learn about like, all right, I'm near this rail station, you guys really dig into the details there for particular stations on what you're going to do, right?
We do. Yeah, it's very robust. It's over 100 pages. So we did dive into the details at specific locations, specific assets, specific stations. Absolutely.
We're going to pivot here to the Waterfront Conference. And so you were on this panel, Cloudburst Solutions for Communities. Can you give my listeners maybe just a broad overview? What was that, the whole purpose of that?
Sure. The panel was, again, about cloudburst planning, and I'd love to get into what a cloudburst is and defining it. But the focus really was on discussing mitigation strategies for cloudburst events and solutions to torrential rains. Our conversation was really about stormwater management, design, construction, but then also partnerships. So the thing about cloudburst planning is it really takes a multi-sector approach, and everyone has a seat at the table when it comes to managing for those events.
You're getting to this, but why are dealing with cloudbursts so important to MTA?
Yeah, so I was very excited to be included, to have a seat at the table coming from the MTA, because cloudburst events are indeed impactful to our infrastructure and to your commute, particularly with the subway system. I'd love to get into this as well. Since 63% of the subway system is underground, it's uniquely vulnerable to torrential rain events. So it was great to be able to talk about that, to talk about some of the tools that we have in our toolbox to mitigate those impacts.
When I first saw the panel named Cloudburst, I wasn't quite sure because here in Tucson, if you're not familiar at all, we have a monsoon season. The last couple of months, people realize we actually get a lot of rain, and we call them rain bombs or microbursts. And so I didn't realize it's basically the same thing as a cloudburst, just this really intense rain situation. Different terminology, different parts of the country. On that note, can you give me maybe a successful or maybe a project that you're working on at MTA where you're dealing with cloudbursts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background about how the stormwater actually enters the system and why it can be impactful. So obviously, the subway system, as I mentioned, about 63% is underground. There's a lot of entrances and exits to the stations, obviously. And it's those entrances and exits, and then also the street vents on the sidewalks that are entrance points for stormwater. So when there is significant street flooding and significant sidewalk flooding, that water can enter our system. And so a couple of the tools that we have in our toolbox are passive strategies. At the entrance to some stations, we add a top step. So instead of just going straight down the stairs to enter the station, you step up onto a step and then you go down. And what that small step does is it keeps that storm water that's on the street and on the sidewalk from flowing down the stairs. And then we also have something called raised vents. So I mentioned the street vents. Those are usually even with the sidewalk. And what we do is we elevate those vents above the sidewalk so that the stormwater, again, isn't able to penetrate the vents as much. So they're passive, and that's great because the thing about cloudburst events is we typically don't have a lot of warning. We can't deploy protections against cloudburst events just as we typically do for coastal surge events. It's these passive strategies that we're really relying on.
You just talked about the panel, though, but how overall, just your thoughts and reflections on the Waterfront Conference, how was it useful to you, to MTA, and I guess any partnership you might have with the Alliance?
Yeah, I think it was an excellent event. There were so many inspiring speakers there. A couple that come to mind, Lorian Farrell, Dr. Stephen Hammer, Jessica Granis, who did the keynote address. I think they were all very inspiring. And I think when you think about water management, the MTA isn't the first agency that comes to mind. But I'm glad that we were able to partner with the Waterfront Alliance as part of this event and also continue our very strong partnership with the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, which is really leading cloudburst management for the city of New York.
Did you have a favorite moment at the conference?
A favorite moment? I'm going to have to say the lecture by Lorian Farrell. It was incredibly inspiring, and she received a standing ovation for good reason. I think I really resonated with what she spoke about on a personal level, and I think what she highlighted was just the resilience of the climate community and our ability to come together to solve this issue that is climate change.
All right, fantastic. Erin, thanks for coming on the podcast and good luck with what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Lee Clark. Lee is responsible for managing the New Jersey Future Funding Navigator program at New Jersey Future. Hi, Lee. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks so much for having me on. I really do appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your story. Now, give my listeners some background there. What is New Jersey Future?
New Jersey Future focuses on smart growth infrastructure and trying to make New Jersey more sustainably friendly when it comes to climate resiliency. We work statewide. My program, for example, is a statewide program working with both drinking and wastewater systems. So we do everything from policy to on-the-ground organizing to conducting original research. So we really span the wings when it comes to infrastructure and environment.
Yeah, I noticed that on the website. The research section, and not a lot of nonprofits doing this kind of work actually generate their own research. So obviously things people can poke around and learn more about. So you just mentioned it, but I want to hear a bit more. This Future Funding Navigator program, give us some more details. What are you doing there?
So we just launched last year of April. So we are a fairly new program, but we work with public water systems across the state of New Jersey, and we help them find and identify forms of funding, either through the state revolving fund or federal and state grants, to help with capital improvement projects, because we found that New Jersey has some of the oldest water infrastructure throughout the nation. And we want to make sure that we're able to assist municipalities in funding their water systems in order to ensure safe, quality water to their residents.
You were at the Waterfront Conference. I think there's obviously a lot of overlap, but what brought you there? Why was it important for you to go to the Waterfront Conference?
A key element of that panel that I was on was about identifying key funding sources for climate resiliency. So a lot of what we spoke about were stormwater utilities as a potential funding apparatus for municipalities. This is one avenue that we do want to explore as a possibility for water systems to fund capital projects and to try to lessen the tax burden on residents in the long run.
You just mentioned that you came to the conference because you were on a panel, and the name of the panel was Stormwater Utilities as a Key Solution to Resilience Funding. You just mentioned the funding, but more broadly, what was the whole panel trying to accomplish?
Oh, yes. And this was multi-state. We had me representing New Jersey. We had panelists from New York and then another one from DC. But it's all about how do you engage the public? Because we want to educate the public on what does water financing look like. We want to make sure that this engagement is transparent and authentic. And we also want the public to understand what kind of projects can be funded and what kind of projects should be funded. So in my area that I work in, I focus on drinking and wastewater. And it's funny because when your water comes out your tap or when you flush your toilet, no one really thinks about where it goes or how it's managed or operated. So that's the side that I work on with the operators and the elected officials to make sure that they can identify funds to keep it going. Because as soon as it doesn't work, your average ratepayer has a huge problem and they don't want to see their taxes go up. So how do you do that by utilizing what's already here? So state funds or federal funds.
Can you give us some more takeaways from the panel itself? There were people asking good questions. Were the other panelists bringing up points you hadn't heard before?
So it was a little bit of both. It was really an eye-opening experience for me to learn more about DC and New York. But a lot of folks had questions about stormwater runoff. For example, New Jersey is a home rule state, right? What happens when a municipal runoff goes into another municipality? What are the consequences? What are the legalities? And really, because each municipality has its own rights and power to create its own local laws, it's something that the state's really looking to help provide guidance on, whether it's a regional approach, whether it's a statewide approach, or whether it's providing technical assistance, funding. There's a wide range of possibilities, but folks were very interested on how we handle stormwater as a state, and also what are the funding avenues or doors that municipalities and elected officials should be looking at.
I'm just curious, just within your position there, do you sense the general public understands how important it is to manage stormwater? Because it's not necessarily the sexiest subject. When you mention stormwater, people might roll their eyes, but my goodness, in your neck of the woods, stormwater management is such a huge issue.
You know what? So it's one of those issues that the general public doesn't find concerning until it happens to them. So we literally have municipalities, or let's say streets in municipalities, that become rivers during heavy rain flows, right? And New Jersey has some of the most impervious coverage in the nation. I believe it's around 12.1% of the entire state is covered in impervious coverage. But we're finding more and more flooding happening in our urban areas, our suburban areas, and even leaking into our rural areas. I would say if we were to ask the average resident what is stormwater, they probably don't know. But if you were to ask them about a flooding event that happened to them personally, they'll have 5 stories to tell you. And then once you connect it to, oh, here's the technical definitions and what we're working on, then the light bulb will go off in their head. So it's all about education.
I'm here in Arizona, and I think the definition of impervious surface is a relative term, and everyone wants to do these nature-based approaches. And so here in Arizona, we have this rock-hard soil, and so when we get these big monsoon rains, it barely penetrates, and then it just starts flooding. And it's all, you could just argue that it's nature-based approaches to stormwater management, but it's probably harder to penetrate than some of the roads that you have there in New Jersey. So it's all relative.
Yeah, and Jersey has its own way. But we tend to be one of the more urbanized states in the nation. One of our biggest issues that we have to get over is urbanization. Because we have so much concrete, so much asphalt, how do we turn some of that into more absorbable surfaces, green and open spaces, or just smarter infrastructure that absorbs a lot of this water far more effectively? It's not just going over the surface, but actually going into the earth or even being reused in some way.
All right, we can't spend much time on this, but your background, even before in your current position, and I think it's just very useful for my listeners that you were involved with the Green Acres program. Can you just really briefly tell me what that's all about?
So the Green Acres program is a agency within the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. We are tasked with land acquisitions and land development projects. So New Jersey has some of the most, I believe, the second in the nation open space preservation, and it is Green Acres' task to purchase as much green open space as possible to preserve lands, and then also help with the development of recreation projects. So this can go by municipality, by county, to preserve as much open space as possible.
Can you tell us a little bit about any partnership that you have with the Waterfront Alliance? Is it a group you work with? Do you go to the conference on a regular basis?
So I first became engaged with the Waterfront Alliance when I was working for New Jersey League of Conservation Voters some years ago. They are doing amazing work between both New York and New Jersey. Have partnered with them in the past in some of my previous roles, and I'm actually glad to have been invited this year around to participate on the panel for their conference. I had done another conference with them during COVID, so it was virtual, but it was just great to be back in person with folks again and get to network, see faces, see people face to face, and also answer as many questions as I could, because We got some great questions during the panel, but I believe some of the best questions came after the panel because you have some folks who just aren't comfortable asking a question before an entire audience.
Did you have a favorite moment at the conference?
That's a tough one. I would say overall, my favorite moment at the conference was the very location of the conference itself. The fact that it was held at the Jewish Heritage Museum. There was so much history just to look at while you're going from seminar to seminar. And I believe that kind of history is just important to know and to understand and to just digest. Also, just seeing the river-esque pictures of the New Jersey state coastline from New York City. But I think something that the Waterfront Alliance did very well was their organization of all the seminars. As I was going in and out of them, I was very taken by the expertise and the knowledge of all the panelists. And it just made me feel even more appreciative of being a panelist myself because I felt like I was really part of a high caliber array of speakers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. So if my listeners want to learn more about what your organization does, what do you recommend?
The first thing I would recommend is visit our website at njfuture.org. Get to see some of the recent issues that we've worked on. Like I said, we do a lot of work on policy. We do a lot of work in providing organizations with original research, whether it's in land use, water infrastructure, you name it. We do a lot of it, and even community planning. And then I would also recommend reaching out to us. We do a lot of outreach, and my program specifically handles a lot of outreach with interested municipalities that want to learn more about water finance, water funding. So give me a call or even email me. My information's on the website.
Fantastic. Lee, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Adam Friedman. Adam is the co-founder of OnePrint. Hi, Adam. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Briefly, just for my listeners, tell us just at a very 30,000 foot level, what is OnePrint?
OnePrint is a 3D printing construction company. We specialize in coastal and land infrastructure, as well as housing and commercial building.
We can't go into all the things that you do, and I'll have links in my show notes to your website, and it's really cool. You guys are just doing some really cool work. But I want to talk about this article I found that I think will cue you up about some of the work that you're doing. And the title of this article is OnePrint is commercializing the technology that could 3D concrete print us out of our climate woes. Wow, what a title. I love that. But walk us through that. What's that all about?
OnePrint has an amazing collaboration with the University of Miami. We also have a collaboration with Engineering with Nature, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, ERDIC division. And what OnePrint and University of Miami has developed IP that can be scaled. And this IP is called the Sea Hive technology. Sea hives are structural coastal protection units and systems that not only mitigate waves, but also promote habitat growth.
I guess what is that process? They approached you. And so part of this is they're interested in climate adaptation and climate resilience, right? And so they see these artificial reefs being, like, there's multiple purposes to them, right?
Correct. A couple different purposes for the wave mitigation systems, also known as sea hives, produced out of the University of Miami. There are near shore, there are offshore, and really what this was made for is protecting our coasts, but also increasing habitat. Because what they have found is habitat also has a structural component when protecting our coastlines from waves.
This project with the University of Miami, is the stuff actually out there in the water yet? Or are you still in the process of constructing these things? What's going on there?
Yes, so these have been deployed in a few areas. Wahoo Bay in Pompano Beach, Florida, also North Miami Beach. There will be newer installations in Jupiter, the more in Wahoo Bay, and outside of Elliott Key.
Do you find that there's a lot of interest in this? And I think of areas that might not even have even natural reefs, but they might be interested in something that's going to mitigate the wave damage. Are you finding clients that are reaching out and just really focusing on that?
Absolutely, Doug. We are looking to expand up the East Coast and into the Gulf Coast. Ideally, we will be looking and talking with potential customers and agencies within the New York City tri-state area and some other cities down along the East Coast. We also have some partners and discussions going on internationally as well.
I'm sure your clients, let's say that they're even a local government, they're interested in just protecting beaches and protecting seashores and such. But are you finding that people are actually asking about your product in the context of climate adaptation? They're aware, they're looking out that distance and thinking about the impacts of sea level rise, or is it still just more practical? Okay, we just want to protect our beaches.
One of the products in our portfolio are seawalls. And seawalls are important because of the sea level rise that many local governments are changing some policy that calls for higher seawall. In the case of South Florida and Broward County in some areas, it's as much as 2 feet needs to be to existing seawalls to account for this. And this is something where we can come in and rapidly help with the building of these walls and as well as the lessening of wave energy before it hits the wall.
Your company attended this Waterfront Conference. Why was it important for you to be there?
Yes, we attended the Waterfront Conference with our interest being that we would love to expand into the New York City area. Our investor is in the New York City area. I am from New York, upstate New York, and we have vested interest in ensuring that New York City stays protected and is a thriving economy and a place to live for many years to come.
And tell me a little bit about any sort of partnering that might be happening with Waterfront Alliance.
Yes, of course. We really enjoy working with the Waterfront Alliance team. We have met with them a few times, and we're excited to go after our WEDG certification.
If people want to learn a bit more about what you guys are doing there at OnePrint, what should they do?
Feel free to go to our website. It is www.oneprint.one. That's the number 1, print.one. Also follow us on Instagram or LinkedIn, or reach out to me directly. Love to help you and better understand any of your coastal protection or habitat creation needs, anything from artificial reefs to seawall and any other products that we might offer.
All right, Adam, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Doug. Thank you for everything that you do.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Justin Bauman. Justin is a rising senior engineering management student at Stevens Institute of Technology. Hi, Justin. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Doug. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
All right. We got a student on. I really love this. First off, tell us a bit about what you're doing there at the Stevens Institute.
My major is something a little bit special. So at most schools, they don't have engineering management as an undergraduate degree, but at Stevens, we were one of the first schools to implement that degree. So first 2 years of my life in Stevens were pretty much doing mechanical engineering courses. And then last year, my junior year, was a lot of kind of info systems and more data-driven team leading stuff. And hopefully the same will ensue next year in my senior year.
I've encountered a few people from the Stevens Institute, like coastal adaptation, climate change is a big priority, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We have some leaders on our campus, especially people like John Miller, the head of the Davidson Laboratory here. It's pretty awesome having people mention my school and talk about heads of the field like him. What
brought you to the Waterfront Conference? Right, it's not always an easy thing for students to get to. How did you hear about it and why did you go?
I had my advisor actually reach out to me about the Waterfront Conference and say that there was an opportunity to be named a Waterfront Scholar by filling out an application, which would waive that application fee. So that meant there was pretty much no barrier to entry for me. It was before my internship started, and it was right after my school year ended. It was perfect. The Waterfront Conference is something that was almost right up my alley. It's an awesome networking event. One of my favorite things in the world is meeting people. That's why I'm not just an engineer and I'm not just a people person. I'm an engineering manager. So it was an opportunity to meet people and network, but also network about something that's really cool and a super pretty much like moral application of engineering, which is coastal resiliency and adaptation.
Tell us a bit about, there's all these different sessions. How did you decide what to attend? And you can't tell me everything that you attended, but could you tell us maybe one or two that really stood out for you?
Funnily enough, I think names and achievements were a big part of why I chose each section. I didn't follow one specific track throughout the process, but I did look for individuals whose careers I had followed in the past or I admired. For example, one of them was the Chief Resiliency Officer of Hoboken. I'm from Hoboken. I currently live in Hoboken. Seeing that, A, my city had a Chief Resiliency Officer, and B, my Chief Resiliency Officer being a speaker at this conference was pretty mind-blowing to me. So I made sure to find the time in my schedule to hear him speak. And the same goes for when I see one of the lead architects of the New York City High Line. That's something that I've enjoyed and I really admire for the engineering prowess and architectural prowess. So I think more so it was a mixture of admiration and fanboying and also just sheer interest that kind of came together to push me to attend these different sessions.
Do you see yourself doing climate adaptation work when you graduate from school?
After that conference, I have to say that I think it's going to be something that I really try and forge my way into. Some really awesome people near the end of that conference reached out to me to give me some opportunities and insight. Pretty much at the top of that stack being Nick Brown, who works for HDR and is a climate scientist, and his company HDR is doing a senior design project with my university, Stevens. And it's something along the lines of perhaps it's going to be beach nourishment or marsh restoration for wave attenuation. And it seems like that may be the best opportunity in my life to get into a field that I'm really interested in. He quite literally fell in front of me at the end of the closing plenary. He just came up to me and said, "Oh, Stevens, right? John Miller." And I went, "Yep, that's my school." And he told me that he had a really cool senior design capstone that he could potentially want me to be part of. So at least with that having been said, absolutely, it's a field that I really eagerly want to break into and start building myself up in.
At the very end, I was doing interviews with people on the main stage, and I was interviewing Diane Dillon Ridgely, and there was a bit of a fun moment with you. Can you just briefly tell us about that?
Yeah, totally. I was sitting in, I think, like the third to front row just because I'm there. Why not sit near the front? And when you asked Miss Dillon Ridgely what her favorite part of the conference was, she mentioned the beginning of it, which that could have been anything, and I didn't think anything of it. And then she starts describing how at the beginning of the day, I recognized Miss Dillon Ridgely and I approached her and I had a really wonderful conversation with her just because of how impressed I was by her as an individual. I also got to meet the chair of the Waterfront Alliance Board of Trustees, Kathy Robb. And near the end of our conversation, when everyone was going inside, I stayed back and I spoke with Miss Dillon Ridgely and I walked inside with her. And I guess that left a really lasting impact. And it was pretty phenomenal to see that she pointed that interaction with me out as her favorite part of the entire Waterfront Conference, which is mind-blowing because it was such an outstanding event. Yeah, and I was actually called up on stage in front of all of these unbelievably decorated professionals, being just a random college kid from Jersey. It was pretty cool and pretty mind-blowing, and everyone I tell about it tells me that it sounds like something from a show or a movie, and I have to say I completely agree. I don't know how I'm ever going to top that one.
My final question was going to ask you what was your favorite moment of the conference, but I think you probably just answered it.
I can't say having everyone ooh and ah at me as an individual wasn't awesome, but I don't want to say that was my favorite part. I feel like that's a little bit shallow. I would say it was the ensuing connections after that, because the amount of people when they saw Miss Dillon Ridgely say, "This kid's really cool and he cares a lot about this subject and he's really eager to learn." A lot of people heard that and they just lasered onto me. And I had all of these fantastically intelligent people coming up to me and introducing themselves to me. The entire day, it felt like I had been chasing these connections and these nuggets of knowledge from these individuals. But after that closing plenary, they were pursuing me and they were pretty much just like dropping this knowledge on me without me even asking. And that was outstanding. And of course, having someone speak to me about a senior design capstone and potentially setting me up for the next year of college, and it's pretty much a course at Stevens, having someone offer me a project to do for the next year of my academics is pretty unbelievable. So I would say all of the people who took interest in me after that interaction was pretty outstanding and pretty rare.
All right, Justin, it's been a treat having you on. Obviously, you made impressions with other people there, and I look forward to seeing you at adaptation conferences in the future. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much, Doug. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, guys, I am back here at the end of the episode with Courtney, and we're going to wrap up this episode. And I just want to acknowledge this was a one-day event, as you guys figured out. So I wasn't doing interviews there on site. So these were all interviews that I was able to do after the fact. And so there's a lot of past tense. It wasn't actually at the conference. I want to acknowledge that. But Courtney's coming back on here at the very end, and we're going to do a wrap-up. Hey, Courtney, welcome back.
Thanks, Doug.
First off, just congratulations. What a fantastic event. Thank you for bringing me in. You had me doing different things there, and maybe you want to describe that. I'll certainly say some things in my own kind of conclusion, but kudos. Can you give me some of that? We're going to dig into it a little bit here, but just your first impressions of what happened.
I was really pleased that people told us there were things they learned, even the seasoned professionals who've been working in the climate resilience space and adaptation space in the New York, New Jersey region for over 12 or 15 years. And that shows us that the level of conversation that we were able to have, and also just the variety of people who we really tended to have on the panels really worked out. We intended for every single one of our panels to have somebody from a community or from a community perspective, as well as professionals and experts. And that exchange across specialties is just a real important thing and secret sauce for a lot of solutions. I think that I'm really proud that the Waterfront Alliance does that type of work and brings those conversations to everybody with this opportunity. But I also want to just say, in terms of the makeup, we were so excited to host about 90 young people who had applied to attend the conference for free through a scholarship program. And we heard so much about how valuable the event was for them, being able to go to a location one day and get almost like a graduate level course on all things climate resilience and adaptation. And so much of what we do, we're finding, and this was just ringing loud and clear at the conference, is that what we're doing in New York and New Jersey is applicable to so many parts of the United States as well as the world. And then I think also, I just want to mention, a lot of women led the charge for not only the opening plenary and the panels and that type of thing, but so many women are in the climate adaptation and resilience space, and that really shined through. And the diversity of just generally the whole audience, as well as the leadership and speakers that were there, were really exciting for us.
I agree. I just met so many different types of folks. It's New York City too. It's its own thing, and it's always just fantastic. People are coming from everywhere and doing all really sorts of cool things. And the facility, I just want to acknowledge the Jewish Cultural Center was just fantastic. One of the sessions, you could look out the window and see the Statue of Liberty. How often do you have a adaptation meeting like that? I know we're not going to be able to go through them all, but any of the panels where you learn something yourself?
Yeah, I'd say the one that I really enjoyed and learned so much from was the cloudburst panel. And I think you've interviewed Karen Apple, who led that panel discussion. And one thing that's just so interesting, and I just geek out on it completely, is the New York City subway system and how it's going to have to change and be resilient to climate change. So I learned a lot from Erin Morey, who spoke about that. And I think that the big takeaway from that panel, which I really wasn't expecting, was how important public engagement is. So Waterfront Alliance is all about public engagement. I have a public engagement background working in complex infrastructure projects, and our WEDG program is grounded in the importance of public engagement. And finally, what was really interesting and unexpected is when we asked the chief resilience officers in the opening panel about what keeps them up at night, I expected them to talk about flooding or sea level rise, because that's often the focus in New York and New Jersey, but they talked about heat. And there was actually a muffled response from the audience. It was a surprise too. And then if I think about it, that's not really a surprise. Of course, heat is the number one killer when it comes to climate change impacts. And it's important for all of us working in this field, if we're specialized in water in particular, to look at how this communities that you're working with are needing to hear about how they can have solutions for all climate impacts, not just the impact that you're specialized in or you've come to the community to talk about. So that just really rang through for me as an important part of what the climate adaptation and mitigation field and all of us who are working in this really need to pay attention to, are multi-hazards. And if you're just working in water, include heat, because it is really serious.
So I interviewed Joseph Sakawi from the Alliance earlier, and he told us all the fundamentals about the WEDG program. But just as we close this out, what is like your big picture vision for the WEDG program?
We are excited that the WEDG verification is applicable to freshwater and coastal systems across the United States. And so we're poised for national growth. We have verified 3 projects outside of the New York, New Jersey region, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. The projects take a long time to get verified, so the growth is relatively slow, but behind the scenes, things are just absolutely popping. So we're just very excited about how the WEDG program can be used as a tool for communities, for professionals. It provides a vision of how to move forward with coastal and waterfront development. You can take the course and learn about what the program is and how it works. And even if you're not a professional and you want to go you're not going to pitch it to a client or something like that. It can really be helpful in your understanding as a community member or anybody who's interested in these topics. I think what's really exciting is the amount of energy that there is behind this. So every time my colleague Joseph Sakawi goes to a conference or does a presentation, we are getting leads and or people who are coming up to us and saying, how can we make this work for our project or our community? And it's also a tool for policy. We know that there are examples of where WEDG has been incorporated into laws or regulations or standards or guidelines. It's an exciting time for the Waterfront Alliance. And I guess what I'll just say is a lot of people are really confused about what to do about climate change. That's not on your podcast and that's not your audience. However, I think that one thing about the energy behind WEDG is that it is a tool that provides some very concrete answers, and that builds excitement on several levels among all kinds of people.
I've been to a lot of adaptation conferences. There's some national level ones. There's regional ones. I was really blown away by the diversity. And you'd mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, but when you go to these adaptation conferences, there's a lot of nonprofits. There's a lot of government types. And the private sector usually are just consultants working with those government types. But you had a crazy mix of private sector people there. And I just kept meeting them. How do you recruit all these people?
We talk to them like crazy over here. There's obviously the nuts and bolts of having great mailing lists, having an amazing database that we've been cultivating for over a decade. There's that. But there's also just the understanding we have that the private sector has so many solutions, that there are so many people within the private sector that care a lot, that have dedicated their careers to solving these problems. And when you find that person in the private sector who's really passionate about the work and sees the value of how a nonprofit can help them and they can be helpful to us, that there's a mutual relationship, that fosters some very strong bonds. And I think that just going back to the complexity of climate resilience and adaptation, which is why you have your podcast and why we love it so much, that complexity is often solved with technical solutions and with solutions that people who have dedicated their careers to can help solve. And so when you find those people and you bring them into this work as a nonprofit, it can be just very powerful and exciting. So I'd say that's the best answer there. There's so many things that go into that, but that's the fundamental part of it.
It occurs to me too is you also have a lot of shovel-ready adaptation projects. You're doing all these coastal restoration projects, and you actually need people to come and do the work. And so much of adaptation has been just in the planning stage. You guys are actually doing on-the-ground adaptation work, and you need the private sector to build a seawall or to. Yeah, it's coming to me now. Gosh, if you give them something to do and someone's getting paid, they're going to come and express interest in what you're doing. So that's very exciting that New York is so well into the adaptation implementation phase. So kudos.
Well, and I'd like to think that was not just because of Hurricane Sandy, that it didn't take a disaster to get us going in that direction. And I think that's true. It wasn't just Hurricane Sandy, but Sandy was the wake-up call. And it really did motivate New York City and New York State to move forward with big solutions like this. So yeah, you're right.
You had the successful conference this year. What's the plan for next year? You guys must be talking among yourselves of maybe some different themes or some ideas that you got. What's the plan?
Yeah, I'm really excited about exploring the idea of how to incorporate monitoring into restoration projects and monitoring generally into all of these adaptation and resilience projects. How are we going to account for what's working and what's not working? And there's so much to be said about the lack of funding that there is for monitoring. So I really want to explore that. Also, our conference is always about green and gray infrastructure. Oftentimes we have to do both at the same time or one or the other. Usually gray doesn't exist just as gray. But there are plans that the Army Corps of Engineers has for the New York, New Jersey region that involve small floodgates. And that's a very controversial topic that we really need to dig into much more clearly as a region. And I think our conference is going to be a place where we can bring in the Corps' plans and also some of the controversy behind the need for smaller floodgates in some of these smaller rivers that empty into the harbor and are on the waterfront. I also want to explore, and I think we've been talking about this a lot on staff, is exploring the role of industrial land use policy in climate mitigation. And the connection is that in the New York, New Jersey region, we have a lot of port terminals. The port of New York and New Jersey is one of the largest in the country, if not the largest. And how we use that land really affects truck traffic miles. And also that land, some of it is going to be very impacted by sea level rise and storms. And so how are we going to marry the best in thinking about how to plan the region with industrial land use policy? Because we need industry and we need it to be sound and we need it to be sustainable. So those all go hand in hand. And then the last thing is that something we don't talk about enough is the huge shortage in engineers who are being newly minted and graduating and or have a few years experience that can be hired to work on these projects. We're foreseeing a huge engineering workforce shortage for the New York, New Jersey region. And in fact, we've heard from the Army Corps of Engineers that they're concerned that funding is not the major impediment to getting the projects done. It's actually workforce, that they're short by hundreds of engineers, civil and structural engineers in the New York, New Jersey region. How are we going to address this problem? So that's something I'm really hoping that we'll be looking at. And then one last thing, just near and dear to my heart, is that I am really excited to talk about horseshoe crabs next year. They are our ancient arachnids who are alive and flourishing in the New York, New Jersey region, and in particular in Jamaica Bay in New York. And they're just it's a great story of resilience. They've survived 5 mass extinction events. And what can we do to make sure that we're not the last extinction event for them that they'll ever experience? So that's just one where we always want to bring these conversations down to what people are experiencing. And horseshoe crabs are just part of life on the beaches in New York, believe it or not. So that'll be really cool.
Very cool. I love horseshoe crabs. I used to do horseshoe crab races in Florida on the beaches there. So they would just cruise along. Also, when I arrived, before the conference started, I was able to join a bunch of folks and we went out on a ferry. That was so awesome. Could you just briefly tell us what we did?
We took a boat tour. We had a party boat, a little one, before the conference. And Waterfront Alliance gave out community champion awards that we are starting now and we'll do annually before every conference. And you got to see the Statue of Liberty. We went up close. Yes. And also a part of it too is we often don't think of New York City as a waterfront city, but it really is. And that's what that boat ride shows us. It's just miles and miles, 520 linear miles of waterfront and coastline for just the 5 boroughs of New York City. We got to see it, part of it, on full display.
Yes, and thank you. That was incredible. And it's always amazing that you just go section after section of people out along the coast doing stuff, eating, exercising. It goes on forever. New York is such a big city, and it was such a unique way to see the city. So thanks again. That was super cool. All right, last question. Can you tell me your favorite moment from the conference?
My favorite moment was when our board member, Diane Dillon-Richley, at the end, asked one of the students who was attending the conference that she had met before the conference doors were open outside. She met him in the morning. She asked him to come up at the end and introduce himself because she was so impressed with his passion and his interest and his impetus to be a person who can solve some of these huge problems in the world. And Diane said, I am so excited because if people like Justin are around, we have hope for the future. And that almost makes me choke up thinking about it because it's just so beautiful. So that's the one thing that I probably won't ever forget. That was just so unexpected and so wonderful.
Okay, Courtney, it was a pleasure having you on and learning about the Waterfront Alliance and the Waterfront Conference. Thank you again for bringing in. I'm excited to share your story with the world. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for being there, Doug. I'm so glad you got to see it. The Waterfront Alliance is a huge fan of yours, so it was such a treat to have you. Thank you so much.
Okay, Adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to the Waterfront Alliance for bringing me in to cover the Waterfront Conference. As you heard from just a fraction of the attendees, it was a fantastic event, demonstrating many communities are full steam ahead when it comes to implementing on-the-ground adaptation. There was such positive energy, not a doom and gloom moment at the event, just hundreds of people wanting to take action in the face of climate change. It's an event they host annually, and I highly recommend it, not only to represent your work, but to network with a growing community of adaptation professionals. Thanks again to Courtney and the Alliance team for hosting me. It was a thrill to interview 3 of the speakers during the final keynote session. I had some fun with it, but I also learned a ton. Definitely look at the show notes if you want to learn more about any of my guests in this episode. Okay, Adapters, that was an amazing partnership with the Waterfront Alliance. If you're interested in learning more about how your organization can partner with America Adapts, showcasing your achievements through a widely acclaimed podcast that boasts a large network of climate and adaptation professionals, then reach out to me. I'm at americaadapts.org. I am humbled to have collaborated with such prestigious partners as Battelle, the U.S. Department of Defense, NRDC, the Waterfront Alliance, University of Pennsylvania at Wharton, World Wildlife Fund, UCLA, Harvard University, and many more. So let's add your organization to this esteemed list. Okay, Adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.